Hi, this is Lisa Amaya Jackson, and I am pleased to introduce this podcast series. Our Category 2 sites have been discussing evidence-based treatment within an evidence-based practice approach, and while we have many EBTs we are proud of in our network, we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we can hear from a pioneering expert researcher in the field of traumatic stress on the evidence-based treatment she developed called cognitive processing therapy. Dr. Resick will share from not only what is the evidence for this treatment, but from the black box of how the use of research data informs the EBT and the shaping of its key elements and application so that it is translated into the best treatment for those clients that are seeking help for the target symptoms. Cognitive processing therapy is an adult treatment, and its application to the NCTSN is not just to learn from research and science, but also that it's a treatment that is being used in the NCTSN when we see a parent's need for treatment intervention as we work with them and their children.
In this segment, we're going to talk about differences in how the therapy has changed over time and changes in theory, both cognitive theory and biological theories. So I mentioned this study earlier. We did a second study after the CPT versus PE study where we dismantled CPT into its component parts. When the results first came out, people were saying that the mechanism of change was the written accounts and that we didn't need all that cognitive therapy. So I thought, well, let's test that and see if that's the case. In which case, then we could just do PE if that would be the important component of it. So I did a study where I had 150 women, and these are women who could have adult or childhood traumas happen to them. You can see their index events are listed below. 31% chose as their worst event, which is what we call the index event. Had adult sexual assault as their index event. 38% had their child sexual abuse history as listed. Adult physical assault was 23%. And you can see child physical assault was rarely selected, although if you look at the next column over, it's pretty common. 78% at the bottom there had a child sexual abuse history, and 73 or 74%, rounding up, had a child physical abuse history. The majority had adult sexual assaults, adult physical assaults, and of those, 60% were physical or domestic violence. Average length of time since the index event was 14 years. As we typically find, there was about a 50% comorbidity with depression, 20% with panic disorder. In civilian samples, and particularly with women, we rarely see a lot of substance abuse. They got ruled out if they were dependent, but we didn't see much abuse, and we just asked them not to use while they were in treatment. They couldn't be currently suicidal, homicidal, or psychotic. So here's the three conditions when we try to dismantle. The CPT plus A is what we're now calling the full protocol, which means it's including the written accounts. We compared that 12 sessions, 60 minutes, twice a week with CPT without the written accounts. And they used that extra time when they would have been going over the written accounts in the session and doing some Socratic questioning with extra time spent going over the other kind of components of CPT. They had an extra session of ABC sheets. The therapist spent a lot of time doing clarifying questions with them about the trauma, working on their stuck point log, and then moving on to the next phase, which would have been the challenging questions sheet. So they still had 12 sessions. The hardest one to do was the written accounts, and I set it up to be like we were doing prolonged exposure at the time. There were only 2 sessions in CPT, so we had to turn that into a full therapy. So that was same amount of therapy contact time, but it was 7 sessions. The first week they had 2 60-minute sessions, and then they had 520-minute weekly sessions. So they would meet with the therapist for a bit, go over their homework, their practice assignment, to read the account or add to it. They were put in a room to write for an hour, and then they came back and read to and processed the therapy with the therapist. And the therapist could not do any cognitive therapy. The results were a bit of a surprise to me. Of course, I developed CPT with the account, so I was assuming and hypothesizing that it would be the best. And in fact, it fell right in the middle. There was a significant overall group difference between the written accounts only and the CPT without the accounts. And you can see there's no difference at pretreatment. That's not a significant difference at the 6-month follow-up, but they were different at every other time point. The interesting thing is when we look at the session data, at week 1 up through session 2, we don't see much difference. But then by week 2, which is session 4, where they've had their impact statement and they've had their ABC sheets, we see a clinically significant drop in the therapy in their PTSD. Unlike the people who are writing their accounts, their scores stay up until they finish writing their accounts, and then they have their clinically significant drop at week 3, which is at session 6. So it took 2 more sessions for them to have that drop, and some people actually have increases in scores when they write their accounts. And then the clinically significant drop in symptoms for the written accounts didn't happen until session 8. So this looks very linear, like you'll see with prolonged exposure, but much more rapid drop if they did the CPT without the account. So that was a bit of a surprise to us. And I stopped doing CPT with the accounts. The only exception to that is we did a study where we looked at, as I mentioned in the very first segment when we were talking about dissociation, we found that people who are high dissociators do better with the CPT plus the accounts, probably because the story is fragmented in their brains and they need to put it together. They didn't do better just going over it again and again and again like they would in written accounts, but they did best when they had the opportunity to put the story together and then do the cognitive therapy. Medium dissociators, low and no dissociators did better with the cognitive therapy only. This study was actually a clinical data that was collected in a residential program by Kate Chard, and she also compared CPT versus CPT plus A, which is now what we're calling CPT plus accounts. And you can see at pre-treatment, mid-treatment, and post-treatment, no significant differences. So in the end, whether you looked at that previous slide that I showed you, there's no value added by doing the accounts. They eventually catch up after they've written their accounts, but there's no value added for doing the accounts. It just may, in fact, slow their recovery down. And we had a 15% higher dropout rate when they wrote their accounts. And in this particular study, where she was looking at their clinical data, she again found no value added from doing the written accounts. They did just as well without them. So we changed the name. It used to be CPT was the version with the accounts, and then when we were doing that study, we called it CPTC, which was a little redundant to say CPT cognitive, since the C in the beginning is cognitive. So we started calling it the version with the accounts CPT plus A, and we're now calling CPT the version without the accounts. So change in cognitions. We started looking, given those results, it can't be habituation, which was the mechanism of change that people thought was creating the change in PTSD. It wasn't due to the account, going over the accounts and going over the trauma in detail. So we started looking at cognitions, and a number of people started looking at cognitions. So the question is whether cognitions are co-travelers. Do they change at the same time as the PTSD? Are they a byproduct of the change in the PTSD? In other words, the PTSD changes and then the cognitions change, or do they precede the change in PTSD? So if cognitions, their thinking, precedes the change in PTSD and not the other way around, this would indicate a top-down effect on PTSD. meaning from the thinking down, not the habituation on up. Gallagher and I looked at hopelessness as a mediator of CPT and PE, and we found that changes in hopelessness predicted change in PTSD more in CPT than PE. Jeremy Schum looked at a study, and he did a cross-leg panel, which means you're looking from one time point to the next to see which affects which, and found that from pre-treatment to mid-treatment to post-treatment in veterans who received CPT, they looked at negative beliefs about self, others, and self-blame, and they found that pre-treatment to mid-treatment changes in self-blame and negative beliefs about the self predicted and temporally preceded the changes from mid to post-treatment PTSD. In other words, the cognitions came first. So in both of these cases, the cognitions are coming first before you see the change in PTSD. There have actually been 2 studies with prolonged exposure that have found the same thing. Zalta et al. Looked at female assault victims and looked at a cognitive measure that was given at every session along with a PTSD measure, self-report measure, and did what's called a time lag mixed effect regression. Is like a cross lag, and they found a medium to large effect size with changes in cognitions preceding change in PTSD, even though they're doing prolonged exposure. McLean also found that with adolescents receiving PE or client-centered therapy. They did assessments at pre, mid, post, and 3-month follow-up, and also found that changes in cognitions preceded changes in PTSD and not the other way around. So let's switch gears and look at biological theories of PTSD, which you may not be familiar with. And things are changing rapidly, so even what I have on these slides will be outdated soon. One thing that many of you may realize, the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, is not fully developed until somebody reaches their mid-20s. Unfortunately, that means that a lot of people who are likely to experience traumatic events, such as child maltreatment, rape, car accidents, combat, and assaults, are young. They're under the age of mid-20s. They do not have a fully developed capacity to think in nuanced ways about the trauma, which may be why they jump to extreme conclusions about it, because they're still thinking like children. This is a picture of a well-modulated emergency response. I'm sure all of you have had a fight-flight response at some time in your life. An almost car accident, something that startles you or scares you, a near-death experience, or just something that triggers off a fight-flight response. If you look down here at the bottom, the threat would be the trauma, and that would be considered an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to have conditioning or learning to have that trigger a response. And what it does is it triggers the amygdala, which is going to trigger strong emotions, a fear response. And that's going to send out messages to the brainstem to tell the neurotransmitters to do a bunch of things. It's going to send out messages to shut down a lot of functioning, your immune system, your digestion, all sorts of things shut down, because if you're having a fight-flight response, everything needs to go out to your arms and legs so that you can run or fight, and nothing else matters. You don't need to be thinking about your philosophy of life or whether you want a new job, so your prefrontal cortex is going to dim down. It doesn't totally turn off in a normal response in people who don't have PTSD, so that when the danger is over, it's then the prefrontal cortex is going to say, phew, I'm now out of danger, and it's going to tell the amygdala to shut back down again and calm the body back down. Everything goes back to normal. You go back to digesting your lunch and creating new blood cells and growing cells, and etc., and fighting off diseases. That's a normal emergency response. In somebody who's had a trauma, because they're having so many trauma triggers, they're very quick to respond. And this then becomes a conditioned stimulus. That's why I'm putting a little alarm here instead of the the actual trauma, because it becomes a conditioned response that's very quick to respond. So anything that reminds you of the trauma, somebody who looks like the assailant, a blue car that was present at the time, the weather, an anniversary response, the time of day, anything can become a conditioned stimulus that's going to remind you of the trauma, and that's going to trigger the amygdala to have a big response, and it gets bigger and bigger over time as you get more and more generalization out to other trauma triggers. And so it's going to send the neurotransmitters out same way, except one of the things that happens in people with PTSD is that their prefrontal cortex goes completely dark. And one of the things you might have heard of is speechless horror. Your speech center is in the prefrontal cortex. And so when you have speechless horror, that's because that part of your brain is actually totally shut down. So what happens is you're missing that last loop that would close down that circuit, and it's much easier to activate the fight-flight response and a very strong emotional response, and you're much slower to recover from it because you don't have your prefrontal cortex is turned off. And it took a while to see that in neuroimaging studies, that what went dark rather than what lit up. But that's been a pretty consistent finding in the literature, that the prefrontal cortex turns off. So what happens, and why cognitive therapy may work? We're making them talk about the trauma, so they have to use their words. This is something that nursery school and kindergarten teachers figured out a long time ago, is when they say use your words, it tends to shut down some of the emotional response. And people who have PTSD have a lot of affect dysregulation because they're easily aroused, but then they don't have the prefrontal cortex to calm them down. So we make them use their words, whether it's prolonged exposure or whether it's cognitive therapy, and we're talking about the trauma, like asking questions like, why do you think it's your fault? Or saying, what else could you have done? What options did you have? Would that have worked? So we ask those kinds of questions. So they are focusing on the trauma. We are getting some activation of their amygdala, but we're keeping it in check by keeping their prefrontal cortex online, by having them use their words and talking. So the cognitive therapy is going to focus the frontal lobe to stay online. It's going to inhibit the amygdala and prevent extreme emotional responses, even while the trauma circuit's simultaneously and sufficiently activated. And that's where we get the new learning happening, is when we can keep them, keep their brain actually thinking and keep their amygdala in check. And we're actually teaching them affect regulation. Now, in psychobiology, all traumas may not be equal, and it's not all about fear. Most of the studies that had been looked at originally were a lot about the fear circuitry. One of my colleagues down at Fort Hood and in San Antonio, Amy Ramage, was involved in a study where I was doing a CPT study, and they had asked people if they would come and get imagery done before and after having their CPT. Now, this is just the baseline data, and we're in the process of working on the post-treatment data. But they divided the kinds of traumas they had into danger traumas. In other words, it was a life-threatening event to themselves. These are all active military, or a life threat to somebody else right near them. Or the non-danger, which turned out to be the majority, was aftermath of violence. They had to they found out about somebody dying afterwards that they were friends with. They had to go and help clean up after a terrible, disastrous event. Moral injury by self, moral injury by others. In other words, they killed somebody and it was against their moral code, or they accidentally killed somebody that was a civilian or something, for example. And so those non-danger traumas, they were not personally in danger themselves versus the danger people. And so they were given script-driven imagery. They did PET scans. They did MRIs. I'm going to show you just baseline data here. And this looks very complicated. I only want you to look at two things, and that's where the two asterisks are. There's 4 groups here that they looked at. We had the people that were coming through my study who either had the danger traumas or the non-danger traumas. And you can see those are the blue and the green ones. They also found a group of combat controls who had a criterion A stressor in combat but did not have PTSD. And then they found a group of civilian controls who had no psychopathology at all. They had no PTSD or anything else. So there's 4 groups here. Now, the 2 groups I want you to look at here are the right amygdala, when they're resting, is already activated in the danger group. And the non-danger group doesn't look any different than the people who have no PTSD. So what I just showed you may not, in that last set of slides, may not actually account for what happens for people who are have PTSD from non-dangerous situations. So as we're learning more, we're learning it may be more complex than that. If you look down here, this is the left precuneus, and this is where there was another significant finding. In this case, the people who had the danger traumas looked just like the civilians and the combat controls, but the people who had the non-danger traumas were activated in their left precuneus. Now, what the heck is the precuneus? There hadn't been much research on the precuneus because it was in a hidden location in the parietal lobe. So a lot of what we learned originally about the brain and how it functioned was from lesion studies and things like that. We're learning a lot more as we're getting more sophisticated in our imagery studies. But it appears to have a wide range of functions, including self-processing operations, cognitive tasks requiring mental imagery, and deductive reasoning. The precuneus is associated with remembering past events, with autobiographical reference, placing events in time in reference to themselves. In other words, a lot of cognitive stuff, which makes sense. They weren't actually in danger. They're not having fight-flight reactions, but they're thinking about the trauma and blaming themselves or erroneously blaming others. And this is where we're seeing it being activated, is in the precuneus. So this is more argument for why we should stop thinking of PTSD only with regard to fear circuitry and start considering higher order mental processing. Now, what's happening now is that people are moving beyond looking at single parts of the brain and are looking at networks in the brain. And so that's the next thing that's coming along. And you'll see studies coming out over the next couple of years looking at networks. So let's move away from the theory and talk about how we've now adapted CBT. Besides changing it over to cognitive only, one of my colleagues, Tara Golofsky, came to me and said, you know, I think if I just had a couple more sessions beyond 12, I might have been able to get that person to turn the corner. And so I said, well, why don't you look at that? And so she submitted a grant application and it was funded. And she said, let's think about talking about a treatment completer differently. Not that they've completed 12 sessions, but that they've gotten to a good end state. So what she looked at was that they had to get a low score on their PTSD scale, and they were using the PTSD diagnostic scale developed by Edna Foa. That was a self-report measure that was given every week. If that was below 20 and that they had a depression score below 10, which is pretty normal, that's showing significant improvement. They might have a discussion with them, and she'd let them have anywhere up to 20 sessions, 18, 20 sessions total. I think it's 18 actually. But they could stop early. So if they had 5 or 6 sessions and they were an early responder, then they would discuss whether that person wanted, and it was done by mutual discussion. And then they would have at least one more session, because sometimes people would say, but I want to work on my intimacy, or I want to work on one of the other modules. So they would have a discussion even if their scores were low. And it was always up to the client whether they wanted to continue or stop. But if they decided that they were feeling pretty good and stopped, as I said, 37% of the people in my first study stopped and just dropped out of treatment, and they were doing quite well. They would be asked to have one more session, and they'd be assigned the final impact statement, and then they would be given all the rest of the materials, however early they stopped. The late people would be people who still had high scores, and sessions 10 and 11, the therapist might be saying, in the beginning, they're saying, the goal might be 12 sessions or less, but, if you need more, then we'll give you more. And so you're going to agree to having some extra sessions so that you have more time to bring their scores down. And they're not going to add any new worksheets or any new modules or anything. They're going to use their stuck point log and the challenging beliefs worksheet. That's what a CBW is. To focus on practicing on the stuck points they still have about their trauma, or maybe other traumas, or maybe they have a core belief they've been carrying since childhood that they need to focus on. So they're going to delay the final impact statement until the final CPT session. So here's the results that she got. She had a control condition I won't get into here, but basically they wanted to determine how many sessions were needed to reach a good end state. This was done with a civilian sample, community sample. They had to have a score below 20, BDI 10, and agree to it. And so it was a modified version of CPT, and they did the accounts. Treatment continued until they reached a good end state. They could have 18 sessions maximum, but they could end before 12. And as it turned out, 58% of them stopped early, that they didn't even need 12 sessions. When I created CPT, I made up 12 sessions. That wasn't based on science. It was just what I was trying to fit in and thought it was a reasonable number. It wasn't too long, wasn't too short. But it turned out that 58% actually in community samples typically are less than 12 sessions, at least the majority. 26% needed more than 12 sessions to get to a good end state. 8% stopped right at 12, and there were 8%, that was 2 people who actually had still had PTSD at the end of 18 sessions. They might have needed more, or maybe they would just be a non-responder. But what you can see, as she compared her treatment outcome with my treatment outcomes from my first 2 studies, that first study in blue is the CPT versus PE study, and this is diagnostic status. Remember I said 80% lost their PTSD diagnosis. You can see that there, 20% still have PTSD. The second study, the dismantling study, was a bit more complex. We had a lot of people with very complex trauma histories, as you saw from that slide. But it was a little less than 30% still had PTSD. But compare that to her findings. She only had 2 people who still had PTSD at post-treatment, and then at the 3-month follow-up, she only had 1 person who still had PTSD. And the findings on my study improved a little bit, in both of these studies improved at the follow-up. But again, much better results if you do variable length. I am a big fan of variable length therapy. And in fact, I am currently doing a study that's just about finished. We are down to finishing our last client. This is with active military. They can receive up to 24 sessions of CPT. We're studying the length of time they need. And we're also looking at predictors of good end state, including neuropsychological testing. Particularly, we want to look at cognitive flexibility. We're looking at lots of military variables, internalizing, externalizing, all sorts of other symptom measures to see if we can predict who needs shorter or longer treatment. We have 130 people enrolled in this study, and as I said, we're close to finishing. We're down to the last client finishing treatment, and we'll be finishing up the follow-up soon. So those results will be coming out probably in 2019. The new manual is the comprehensive manual. It covers all kinds of traumas. It has CPT without the accounts as the main therapy in there, although there is a later chapter on how to do it with the accounts. There's also a material on how to do it as a group treatment, how to do it as variable length. There's different populations, different samples, and we have different sections on it. We have new and updated patient handouts. We've simplified the language in many places. We've made changes to the modules, meaning the safety, trust, power and control, esteem, intimacy, those modules and other handouts. All versions of the therapy are included in the manual, and we have sections on different kinds of traumas and issues. Take-home points. The dismantling led to a change in the emphasis on therapy to cognitive therapy only. And I believe that we should follow the data. Just because I developed the therapy doesn't mean we are stuck with it doing that way. And the second change that I think is important is that there's nothing magic about 12 sessions. Cognitive and imaging research support a cognitive approach. Another variation now is doing a flexible length CPT, where you keep strictly to the protocol. You do it in the same order. You don't add sessions in the middle or change what you're doing in the middle. You do the protocol as is, but they can stop early or continue longer depending on their progress. If you start doing other things in the middle of therapy, you are no longer doing CPT, so we can't have any guarantees about how effective it's going to be. So if you have some other idea, then you should study it and collect data on it and publish it yourself. The new book reflects changes in the emphasis and new improved worksheets.